That's right, folks. Another episode of the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. And today we're talking about the top, out wide, and slop playoff schedules. If you're the 1 seed or the 2 seed and you're planning ahead and you want to find out which guys could have blow up weeks in your fantasy playoffs, tune in right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And that's right, folks. Wipe off your screens. Wait a second. Yeah, no, that's Sky Gawasco, folks. That's right. We're doing it. Make it a trifecta this week, folks, already. And by the way, I heard rumors he's going to be on Sunday Live. That's right, for 2 hours, folks. Sky Gawasco has dedicated his life this week to Razzball Fantasy. We appreciate you, Sky. What's going on, man?
Yeah, nice. Bob, I was just telling you pregame. It's good to be in the full flow. You and I used to do this, just you and me. Every show, every article, all the time, 5 days a week until we built a team, bro. So first of all, shouts out to the Razzball squad because everybody's crushing it hardcore. But it is kind of nice for you and I to turn back the clock, man, and throw a couple episodes together. So I'm stoked. And yes, assuming these storms don't completely eliminate my power up here in the Northwest, I should be on Sunday morning as well. So cross your fingers.
I'm going to take the opposite approach. I'm going to be the villain here and say, screw those other guys. You know what? It's good just to have the two guys back. You know what I mean? Forget that. And Derek, forget them all. You know what I mean? Like Jeff, I don't even care. He didn't even respond to my text this afternoon. Now I'm calling you out, Jeff, live, baby. Nice. I need the responses. No, just kidding, guys. Super excited to see all you on Sunday, all you sweet angels on Sunday for Sunday Live for 2 hours before kickoff as we answer all your start-sit questions. Before we dive into today's show, make sure everybody follows across the board at Razzball Fantasy. We have YouTube, IG, and TikTok. We also have great articles and great content on Razzball.com. Do not forget to check out the Fantasy Data tab. I got to tell you, I made a decision last week to start CJ Stroud over Bo Nix. And there was a lot of factors going into it. And the irony is our home versus road split tool screamed Bo Nix. Go Bo Nix. And I was like, nah, I know better than that. That is stupid. These tools are actually really fantastic. If you're really in a bind, I mean this honestly, they are the best tools I could find for free. I swear. So go check it out on Razzball.com. And as always, if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, we do appreciate hit that like and subscribe. And if you decide to listen on the go, we also do it on the audio side. You go to Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. We're famous, basically. It's like Joe Rogan, us on Spotify. I mean, at this point,
last time I checked, I haven't checked since we went live. But last time I checked.
It's dated. It's by the hour at this point. I mean, almost at the minute. So we're excited. But today we're going to be talking fantasy playoffs. So sorry, folks, if you're the 8th seed right now and you're trying to fight your way into the playoffs, this really isn't the show for you. Last week's show is the show for you. Make sure you go check out the rest of season schedules to help you get that playoff push into the playoffs. Today's for the fancy pantses. For the number 1 seed, number 2 seed out there thinking to themselves, all right, we got this thing locked up, basically. Is there playoff X factors that I can find based on schedule? That's what today's show is really about. And hey, listen, if you have a little luxury, hey, maybe, I'm sorry, 6 seed, maybe this show is for you too. But really, in reality, if you have the luxury to trade players that might be a little better in the interim for those elite playoff matchups, maybe this is the show for you. Now, Scott, before we dive into today's show, I gave you a little bit of homework time. I told you all the players that were going on. Has anything kind of surprised you about some of the schedules? And what's your first thoughts about preparing for fantasy playoffs if you are the 1 or 2 seed?
Yeah, one of them is just philosophy. We had a comment. I forget who the person was. Thankfully for you, because I planned on calling you out, not you, Bob, the commenter. So I forgot the name. Lucky for them. But it was on a show on Tuesday. And the first line was basically, I don't need to make any changes, but here's my roster. How am I looking? And I immediately called it out. I was like, bro, the arrogance needs to stop in week 12. Tell me that after you win the championship, because if you take your foot off the gas and you're sitting up in the top 1 or 2 seeds, you can get knocked off quickly. So don't do that. So philosophy wise, schedules mean more now than they ever have heading into the playoffs. So really take that into consideration. And then we're going to break down slot versus wide specifically, but really look at like player matchups as well, week to week, but also ahead a little bit. So if you're in the top half of your league, look 2 or 3 weeks down the road. If you need to win tonight, this week, don't be looking 2-3 weeks down the road. Make a change for this grip right now. And I've been mentioning this for the last week or two on the program. Usually fantasy trade deadlines are Thanksgiving week, which is next week. This season, it fell off a little bit, so it's not week 13. It's actually week 11. Some of them are in the rearview mirror. A lot of them are this week too. So don't get caught blindsided not paying attention to your fantasy trade deadline. So make sure you know that it's in there before you can make these moves, because a lot of the guys we're talking about today are not on the waivers in a competitive league. They are going to have to be tradable. You can wait for some of our deeper sleepers coming up in the next couple episodes, but these guys are going to have to be traded for, and it's going to take some strategy.
Yep. And listen, this guy really brought up a good point too. When you're looking at the bye weeks coming up in the next few weeks too, and like you're a fringe team, like you might not be able to afford one of your top 3 guys being on a bye week. Like, I know this is not the best philosophy always, but if you're on the outside looking in and you have the guys like T. Higgins, for example, and you're like, can I parlay T. Higgins into another asset that's already had their bye that's kind of comparable? Maybe it's something to look at. Yes, T. Higgins has a very good playoff schedule, but you have to get into the playoffs to enjoy those schedules. So, sometimes you got to make tough decisions to win now. So if you are outside looking in, definitely make that philosophy. But today's show is about the fancy people that are already kind of planning ahead a little bit to the playoffs. We do recommend, if you are the 4 or 5 or 6 seed, do not get too cute. You still need to solidify your playoff spot. But if you have locked in a 1 or 2 seed especially, this is definitely the show for you. Today, we're going to be talking about using our slot versus wide tool over on Razzball.com. We have figured out the best out wide and slot schedules and some notable players that could really take advantage of that this week. Today, though, we're going to focus really mostly on the out wide piece. And listen, if you watch this show, this is really where the premier receivers are anyway. Very few teams have elite slot guys. There are teams, of course, that utilize the slot guys, CeeDee Lambs, Amon-Ra St. Browns, Jaden Reeds. Those kind of guys do exist. Lad McConkey's of the world that do get a lot of their fantasy points in the slot. But for the most part, this is where the bread is buttered. Now, let's talk top playoff schedules. And at the top, this is the list that I've kind of come up with, the teams that really kind of differentiated themselves from the pack. Let's start at the top with, well, my beautiful New York Giants. Now, the Giants are going through a little bit of a transition period. Daniel Jones, shout out, pour one out for my homie. And listen, as a 49ers fans, Guy, I feel like me and you are always yin and yang. It feels like injuries every year. We lose Daniel Jones. You guys decide, hey, don't worry. We'll just take Brock Purdy out because we want it to be equal. That's why I appreciate your fandom, Sky, as well.
Niners, Giants, one and the same. You know what I mean? I've been saying that for years.
Yeah. I know. I hear you. So, but Neighbors has really good matchups. The Ravens are the most fantasy points out wide. Then they play the Falcons, which are number 2 over the last 6 weeks. So he has 2 number 1 and number 2 matchups for outside receivers. And then he gets the Colts, which are only 22nd, but that is not a defense that necessarily frightens you. Now, the turnover at quarterback is alarming to an extent, but to be honest with you, it wasn't like Daniel Jones was really lighting it up. And we kind of saw a glimpse of Tommy DeVito last year. Guys like Slayton had somewhat of okay production with him. Nothing too great. But what's your thoughts here about Neighbors? Do you care about the schedule? Are you targeting him? And maybe what's an offer you'd be willing to give for him?
Yeah, a couple things here. So just to reiterate, we're talking week 15, 16, 17. So if you're going before or after that, it's a little bit off. So specifically for the show, we're talking 15, 16, 17. Also, I have a brand new puppy in my house, and the only possible way to keep him from barking this entire show is to give him a squeak toy instead. You pick your battles. If it's a problem, Bob, you can fire me on air. Otherwise, I hope people enjoy squeakies. The issue with the Giants is obviously Tommy DeVito. I'm Italian too. Look, thank goodness I'm on the West Coast. That's
Eyes on,
we're on the West Coast. I'm not here to throw shade. I'm just saying that it could be a little bit difficult. Last year, Darius Slayton was his guy. So we'll see what happens with Malik Neighbors. But Malik Neighbors is a dog, obviously. I cannot wait for you guys to upgrade overall to a real quarterback. 7 targets opening day for him. After that, 18, 12, 15. 8 coming off of 2-week injury. 13, 11, and 10 before the bye week. So he's going to get peppered no matter what. I love Malik Neighbors. You asked me earlier, and I didn't answer your question because I'm a professional and forgot to. But we're talking like highest rate of outside, right? Darius Slayton does not play in the slot at all. 98%, right? So he's the highest on the team, but obviously we like Malik Neighbors. Darius Slayton could be sneaky, and he could be a lot of fun. He's not started in many leagues, but maybe a deeper league or something like that. But take an eye on him just because he got the work last year with Tommy DeVito. So we'll see what happens. You can't sit Malik Neighbors, I don't think, because they're going to have to pepper him, but it could be interesting by the time we get to the playoffs. Also, I hate to look this far ahead, Bob, but we kind of have to. Like, if the Giants are, and this is not a shade, this is strictly a mindset thing. So you and I, I love you, buddy. Let's just be real about things. If they're just selling out and they're looking for draft picks over stats, I don't think they shut down Malik Neighbors per se, but they might be looking elsewhere, doing different things, blah, blah, blah. So it might be a little bit tougher. So you might be looking at other options there on the Giants. But if Malik Neighbors is just ungettable in your league, because for me, it's going to take, I don't know, probably a combo of players, to get him. Maybe a name like Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, George Pickens, Drake London, maybe if you want to get Malik Neighbors, but then do you want to risk it with Malik Neighbors? Love the player, don't love the situation. Really tough at the top for me there.
Yeah, and so just kind of zooming out for a minute, looking at Tommy DeVito, because we did have a pretty decent sample size last year of seeing DeVito play, and I don't really, I'm conflicted here because listen, the Daniel Jones thing, it did not work. Whatever, it is what it is. I don't know if I could fully, if Tyrone Tracy doesn't fumble against Carolina in overtime and they end up going down to win that game, Daniel Jones is probably the starting quarterback. So this whole thing doesn't even make a lot of sense in general. But it is what it is. DeVito, when he played last year, and so I'm just looking at the games where he essentially played almost the entire game. And so he did have, he had only one game over 200 yards passing. And so you're kind of relying on the fact that Neighbors becomes a target hog again. Now, granted, Tommy DeVito's second season, he was like an undrafted rookie last year. It was just completely out of the blue. This kid got no reps. It was supposed to be Tyrod Taylor. He also got hurt last year, right after Daniel Jones. And so DeVito really had nothing going. He just did this all on the fly. So I think that DeVito really could be 80% of Jones. I'm not fully panicked on Neighbors. The problem is, can you get Neighbors on a relative discount? Like the guys that really, like Darnell Mooney is a good example of a name where if a team who has Neighbors is panicked, I don't think you can trade Darnell Mooney. You brought up Drake London. London's schedule is tough. But it almost feels like we saw this with CeeDee Lamb, right? Lamb's still good, but he's like a wide receiver 2 now with the new situation. And he also might be matchup dependent and also home road dependent because he played like the Cooper Rush thing. He plays a lot better at home. So honestly, like Lamb, in my opinion, is another example of this where, Neighbors might be like, and listen, I don't know if there's a home road split thing with Neighbors necessarily, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, what is like Jordan Addison and Darnell Mooney doesn't get it done. I doubt it. And then leveling up again, trying to get maybe a guy like Drake London. I mean, let's be honest. Do you think you would take Drake London for Malik Neighbors right now?
I don't know which one I would want. I think my issue breaking down this exercise, one thing I realized is like, I'm not as excited about some of these players as I thought I would be, strictly thinking about them being wide. First of all, like Tank Dell, we're going to get to the Texans, but I'll jump ahead just for a second. Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs have a lower percentage of out wide, according to Nico Collins. But what it's going to take for everybody to acquire Nico, all three of those guys having an opportunity, like you might want the other guys instead of Nico. So like with Malik Neighbors, I want Malik Neighbors, obviously, but I have no idea what's going to happen with Tommy DeVito and this Giants team. I just really don't. And there are guys like Drake London, I just rather probably have the offense in Kirk Cousins, but Drake, like player to player, I'd rather have Malik Neighbors, but situations, the Falcons all day. So it's a really tough decision for me with them specifically. Because
the irony is like Mooney is the wide receiver 24 in PPR right now, like 13.6. Like he is solid. I think that we have to talk about what's in the analysis, right? But when I get into that, like you just brought up, you're like, I think you're almost in this weird area with Neighbors where he's almost untradeable because you're not going to drop all the way to Mooney, but I don't think you're going to get a London. Like, I don't know if I don't think that, and honestly, I don't know if that makes sense. And if you go to the running back side and you start looking at maybe like a DeAndre Swift type running back, the question is like, yeah, maybe that makes a little sense. If you have the depth at running back and you want to get a receiver like Neighbors, maybe that makes sense. But like, you're not getting the wide receiver 1 Neighbors. You might be getting the mid-range wide receiver 2 Neighbors. So maybe that's a fair deal here.
Yep.
But at the same time, like, I'm cautiously optimistic that Tommy DeVito will be relatively passing game wise similar to Daniel Jones. What differentiated Jones is the rushing ability.
Yep.
I don't think Tommy DeVito has that. But as a pure passer, it's not like Daniel Jones was throwing for 275 every week. So shouldn't we then be optimistic that Neighbors can produce similar, right? So that's where I get kind of like, we don't necessarily have the time to wait, because if he ends up being good with Tommy DeVito, then you're not going to get Neighbors on any discount.
I agree. A tough part of this exercise, though, just being honest, is we're week 12, 13, 14. We're 3 weeks away from fantasy playoffs. Honestly, bro, I hate to say this because I know you're a Giants fan. Tommy DeVito may not even be the starting quarterback for any number of reasons for the Giants. Then you have Drew Lock, who's probably better than Tommy DeVito, but he's Drew Lock. And it's not like Daniel Jones is injured and not coming back or whatever. He's off the team now, which is insane that all went down the way it did, but that's another time. So,
love it.
I mean, Malik Neighbors, dude, it's hard to start off with this particular player because there's so many question marks, man. I'm just the type of fantasy player where, like, I'd rather take, let's say, a lower floor, more boom bust like a Darnell Mooney, right? Or the kind of like, what am I going to get with a Drake London or Mike Evans coming back off injury or something like that, than he's been out there dominating when available Malik Neighbors, because there's so many questions in New York. Like, I just don't like playing with players like that, especially this time of season. Now, look, if I'm undefeated or I have a 1 or 2 losses in fantasy and I could use a wide receiver 3 on a discount and it's Malik Neighbors, I love that because I probably have depth to sell, but I just don't know what's going to happen.
All right. Let's move to the next one. This one I actually think is a very interesting name. It's Jacoby Myers. The Raiders have a very strong schedule. They have the Falcons as well. They have the Jags, which is 2 top 5 out wide matchups. And then they have the Saints at 19, who, by the way, are dealing with so many injuries on the defensive side of the ball. We just saw Jerry Jeudy on the outside play really well. So really, to be honest with you, Jacoby Myers could be a very gettable name, underrated name, especially with the schedule. What's your thoughts here? Is this a player you're willing to grab, and what would you really willing to give up? Oh, you're muted. There we go.
I got puppy squeak going on in the background. I'm trying to help you guys out. This is a player I'm excited about, right? So again, based on the slot versus wide tool, which is for free right now on the slot versus wide tool on Razzball.com. And Jennifer, we do see your question. We're going to get to you after this. So stick with us, please. Thank you for tuning in this evening. Jacoby Myers is 59% out wide. Does a lot from the slot. And then you have Trey Tucker, 78% on the outside. So that's kind of, Bob, that's what I mean in this particular exercise. Because they're on the outside, it's not automatic that they're saying number 1, if you will, right? It's positionally. So for the Raiders, it's Jacoby Myers by a million. I just want to put that out there. For Jacoby Myers, like, I think we had a handcuff episode last night that's now available on the podcast. And of course, here on YouTube, you can check out me and Dave Cruz and Bob broke down our top favorite handcuffs. For me, there's a couple of handcuffs in there, high-level handcuffs, or even like 1B players. Those are the guys I'm shooting for Jacoby Myers. If I have Jacoby Myers, I might want to bolster and make sure that I have a handcuff locked up, right? A high-level guy for me. If I am trying to acquire Jacoby Myers, that player is probably like wide receiver 3 on a fantasy roster. So they might need a backup handcuff or a wide receiver 3 with more upside right now. So I don't think you have to break the bank for Jacoby Myers. A, he's on the Raiders. Nobody trusts him. B, he's good enough, right? He's like a boring Julian Edelman. Like, he gives you 12 fantasy points, 13 fantasy points of PPR every week, but it's not exciting. He rarely scores, but he's a perfect flex wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 to plug and play and make sure you have that baseline. So I'd like to have Jacoby Myers, and I don't think you need to pay much for him.
I mean, listen, 2 of the 3 games since coming back from injury, 6 for 52 and 1 against the Chiefs, 8 for 105 against the Cincinnati Bengals. Like, listen, Gardner, by the way, we are quietly having a really good year when it comes to quarterback play for the most part. I know Cooper Rush, like, for what it's worth, Cooper Rush actually wasn't too bad last week, and like Gardner Minshew is probably the worst season-long quarterback we've had.
Just wait till you see Brandon Allen
and
this week versus the Packers.
you think it's gonna be bad, huh?
Oh, looking nice. Yeah, should be great.
You're excited.
Styles is thrilled.
I gotta tell you though, when I actually look at the situation, like this guy is like the cheapest number one option you can get, and his schedule is elite. Like this is an elite schedule, and like I almost feel like, okay, so what can I actually? In my mind, it immediately goes back to, can I take a Drake London, downgrade to Jacoby Myers, and then also get another asset? Like, I feel like if I am a Drake London owner, knowing how tough their schedule is, can I take a London, downgrade to Jacoby Myers, and then also pick up, and listen, I think last night we kind of saw a little bit of Jaylen Warren from old. I think he's going to start turning a corner, and I really like him season long. We've been kind of talking about him a lot lately, but like, and maybe I'm out of line here and saying, like, can you trade Bucky Irving and Jacoby Myers, get them two for maybe I don't want to say Drake London, but like a DK
Metcalf. Look at that, dude. How about the jinx on DK Metcalf? I love that. I was just looking at it too. And also another sneaky name for fantasy who's disappeared for the last month because of concussions, but coming back, but at the worst out wide schedule is Chris Olave as well. But those teams you're talking about with the bad schedules, the Saints, the Falcons, the Jaguars, the Seahawks, and Minnesota Vikings. So, yeah, I mean, if you can take a big name, Brian Thomas Jr., right? Just direct for Jacoby Myers, I would do that right off the bat. Drake London, as you mentioned. Jordan Addison just hasn't popped yet this year. Obviously, Justin Jefferson's unattainable. CeeDee Lamb keeps coming up, dude. I hate it. I said this exactly when Dak got hurt. I kept saying it. People like, hold it. Let's see what happens. He's good enough, but I think you can get Jacoby Myers and Bucky Irving or a high-level handcuff for CeeDee Lamb. And it might feel gross sending it, but rest of season and once you get to the playoffs, man, that might actually turn out well for you.
It does feel gross. As someone who has a lot of CeeDee Lamb, it feels gross.
I'm sorry, bro. I really am.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm still TBD on a trade. Let's see. I think the problem is, like, I'm in a league where a guy, like, he knows, like, I do a podcast. He knows we talk about it all the time. So when I send him a trade, I'm like, it's a fair trade. He still thinks I'm, like, fucking him over. So that's always fun. And there you go, dropping the F-bomb live. Sorry, Jennifer, if you're still watching.
We get two per show. We're
all right, cool. All right,
let's get into Jennifer's question, though, because she mentioned neighbors, and we had just talked about them. So, Jennifer, good evening. Thanks for tuning in with us.
Well, I was only going to say we only do fantasy football tricks, not tips. So, unfortunately, but we can make it out. We can make an exception for you, Jennifer, and talk a little bit about this. And I'm assuming this is this week's matchup. Now, Jennings, of course, heading into this week was a lock for me, but then now all of a sudden with the Brandon Allen situation, things get a lot more complicated. Waddle, meanwhile, call it a hunch, but he has performed very well against the Patriots with Tua, and so is Neighbors a lock? So I don't think Neighbors is a lock, but to be honest with you, of these three, I would play Neighbors and Waddle. What's your thoughts here?
My goodness, what a upsetting week to have this. 2 weeks ago, you have three. I mean, Neighbors again with Daniel Jones is hit or miss in the past, but he was getting peppered. Jennings has been elite. And then Waddle should be elite. Bob doesn't talk about Jalen Waddle though. But now Daniel Jones is unemployed, still getting paid though. And Jennings, I mean, topples right with Brandon Allen because who knows what's going to happen there. And then I've been thinking about the Dolphins this week, Bob, and I don't want to get too off script here, but I think a lot of the Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill situation is left over from Bill Belichick because Bill Belichick would shut down Tyreek Hill and Tua. And then you could have underneaths to Waddle. But Waddle just hasn't been peppered, and he has a fake injury every game. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. With the guys, though, if you have to start two, I would rank them, I guess. Waddle, Jennings, Neighbors. I just trust the Niners' play calling and overall scheme more than the Giants, but who knows who's going to get the ball this week.
So it sounds like Waddle's in for us out of the three. And I favor Neighbors. You favor Jennings in this matchup. All right. Hopefully that helps, Jennifer. We hope that.
Hey, Bob, right. if Jennifer has any additional questions this week as things develop, could she pop on another one of our programs and
No.
ask us some start sit questions, maybe like Sunday morning or something?
I don't think so. Actually, I'm pretty sure this is it for a while. I think that we're gonna be pretty much done after this episode, and all episodes have been canceled. No, but on all seriousness, I heard a rumor that a bunch of guys get on every Sunday live for 2 hours before kickoff. We do it on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. We break down all your start sit questions. We also do a key injuries and weather updates, so you have all the data you need to know up until kickoff. So join us on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. Let's jump down to number 3. It is the Chargers. So we kind of broke down. Listen, my love for Justin Herbert, I'm in. He's my guy. He's my guy I'm rolling with. I have him in all my leagues this year. I'm in.
Go Ducks.
That I'm still actually relevant in. Quentin Johnson has the Buccaneers 3rd, Broncos 14th, Patriots 7th in fantasy points out wide. Quentin Johnson, is he someone you're targeting?
Yeah, he is, but he's someone I'm more excited to sell if I can, because I think the hype is much higher than it should be. Love my Ducks, love Herbert, love the Chargers. I love QJ. I was a year early, really hyped on him as a rookie and didn't pan out, obviously, but he's coming around. But he has 3 touchdowns in 3 weeks. Love that, obviously, right? He's still wide receiver 8 because he had 118 yards against the Browns. After that, a touchdown, but he had 24 total yards, 48 total yards, 2 receptions each of the last 2 weeks. He's getting targets, but he's not getting the receptions. Kind of uncharacteristic for Justin Herbert that way. But again, with this lineup here, Tampa Bay, Denver, and at New England, I'm a little bit nervous about the Chargers going to New England in championship week for Herbert too. They play indoors. West Coast kid, indoor team going to New England in late December, January. I just don't like that, but we'll talk about it as it comes up. QJ's fun, but I would rather sell him than acquire him. Some players that I think you can kind of move him either way for would be Romeo Doubs, DJ Moore, who we talked about a lot, and Roma Dunze. Both of these Bears guys, Keenan Allen, I think has just fallen too far. But some of those guys who are like middle tier with upside and names and possibility. But QJ also in a particular league, you might be able to sell him higher than that because he has scored 3 consecutive weeks. So if you're selling, the selling point is, hey man, this dude's huge. He's Mike Williams now, and he's with Herbert, and he scored 3 weeks in a row. I just need some other options. Not mentioning, Andy has got a nice schedule, blah, blah, blah. If you're looking to acquire him, it's, hey, man, he's had minimal targets, minimal receptions. Yeah, he's scored, but minimal yardage. But I'd like to just, have that bolster floor. What do you need? Because I do think there's massive upside with him, but there's also a lower floor if he hasn't scored. So, again, another tough player to monitor here. The guy we're not probably going to talk about too much is Ladd McConkey, who everyone's excited about, but he's a slot guy. And then Josh Palmer was my angel this season, and obviously he's disappeared, unfortunately, but he's the one 88% outside. QJ's 97% outside, but then you have Ladd McConkey on the inside too, but that's a name for another show.
Yeah, the other thing I will bring this up too is like last week, if you watch that Chargers game, they came out guns blazing and they dominated that first half. You watch the second half. And by the way, I had Herbert everywhere. I had a little bit of Disley. I had Quentin Johnston. If you watch that second half against the Bengals, they missed so many throws by just a fraction of a fingertip. So many. And you're like, man, this could have been a completely different game. So I understand the 2 for 8 looks bad. But to be honest with you, one thing missing from the Chargers has been pass volume all season. And Herbert just hasn't been needed to throw that much. And the competition's starting to get a little better. The matchups, I know the Patriot matchup you put up is really good point. And I agree, actually. You might fade Herbert going to New England. But Denver at home, Bucks, I like. So I'm in on Quentin Johnson. And honestly, I would probably prioritize him over a guy like Darnell Mooney personally, because I do think that he's emerged as the number 1 option alongside Ladd McConkey. All right.
We mentioned too, Bob, I'll just bring this up quick. You're right. Justin Herbert hasn't had the volume you'd like for an elite quarterback. I think we all know that if Justin Herbert had a coach that would let him sling it 40 times a game, he might be, he probably is the best quarterback in the NFL. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago coming out of the bye, but now we have 6 weeks under our belt. The first 4 weeks of the season, pass attempts, 26, 20, 18, 27. Bye week in week 5. After that, pass attempts, 34, 39, 32, 27, 18, 36 last week. Should be a shootout with Baltimore. Should be a shootout with Atlanta. Should be a shootout with Kansas City. Could be a shootout with Baker and the Bucks if they stay hot. Bo Nix, Double duck game. We love that. Don't
Double.
we, Bob?
We got to go double duck, baby.
Double duck. Also, that game, by the way, has been moved into the spotlight, Thursday Night Football. So I love to see that. So you got a double duck there. That could be a shootout. And then again, New England could be tough, but Justin Herbert down the stretch, we've been talking about it for weeks, could be absolutely on fire. And if he's getting 32 to 34 pass attempts, it's got to go somewhere. So again, I think you could sell and buy pretty easily Quentin Johnston right now. And I'd rather sell personally, but if you're looking to acquire him, I don't think it would take you as much as you might think.
Listen, just to keep going back, but look what you just said, right? Baltimore, the Falcons, the Chiefs, the Bucks, the Broncos. Like, by the way, some of those are really key games. I would say and by the way, most of those are home. Then you have Atlanta in the Dome, which I think is a great matchup. The only one you'd be concerned about really is the Chiefs game, where not in love with it, but at some point, like the biggest difference between the Chiefs early season to now is DeAndre Hopkins and a healthy Juju Smith-Schuster. That offense is, and by the way, they just got DJ Humphries, the left tackle from the Cardinals. I mean, geez, like what do other NFL teams want to just take a shot on talent? I don't understand. Why is it always the same freaking teams? They're like, oh, this guy used to be really good. Okay, we'll just put him on our team for nothing and see how it goes. Oh, it worked out? That's so cool. No one else does it. It's insane. Like, it's so stupid. But anyway, my point is the Chiefs' offense, I believe, will be better, and that's going to force them to keep up. So, listen, we'll agree to disagree on this because I honestly believe that the Chargers, like, I'm this close to cutting C.J. Stroud and just rolling with Herbert up until the fantasy championship and then finding a streamer potentially, because I do agree with the New England thing.
Well,
so
why don't we talk about the Houston Texans team and see if you want to do that?
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, so let's go down to Houston. And by the way, Sky, just live on air, we don't need the private chat. We want the people to know our plans. We're going to cut out the slot. We talked a little bit last week about the Jaden Reed, Jakeem down. One guy that really popped up was Demario Douglas. If he's on waivers and you're struggling at wide receiver 3, he's a fun sleeper. We'll talk about him next week in our sleeper show.
I like that.
Let's get back into it, folks. Texans here are a key. Nico Collins, by the way, is by the way, after the first game back, he got eased into things. His playoff schedule is very nice, too. You do have the Dolphins at 15th fantasy points out wide. Then you have the Chiefs, but then he finishes with the Ravens. And this is another reason why. And by the way, is that Ravens game at home? It is at home. So I might just keep C.J. Stroud and roll with Herbert and then play Stroud in the championship. So forget everything I just said.
I was like, hey, Bob, why don't we talk about this before you? Yeah. Look, do not rage drop in fantasy, Bob. Do not.
I never.
Especially 9 weeks ahead of time. Let's take a breath.
It's 11. It's week 11. Okay, I've been enraged since week 4. All right, so I've been very patient. So anyway, but yeah, so this is another one where Nico, I think, is matchup proof. I'm not concerned about anything. Once he gets back up to speed, the question I think really is, what is a fair offer? Would you trade Chase Brown to get Nico Collins?
I would. Again, so obvious caveats. We have to say them though. It's obviously position dependent. If Chase Brown's your RB1, no. If he's your RB2, RB3, flex, rotational player, absolutely. Another thing to think about with these teams in general, and we need to mention this as we go down here, but the Texans, all 3 of these guys, right? They're a rare team that all 3 of these guys are playable and they all have great schedules moving down in the playoffs. They got Miami, Kansas City, and Baltimore. And again, I don't know what Houston's going to be as far as a playoff race, but all those are competitive games for the other teams, most likely, right? Except for Miami. But we'll see what happens. They have a bye week in week 14. So you need to be careful with some of this stuff because if you're acquiring one of these guys, you're absorbing a bye week, especially if you're giving away a player that doesn't have one. So just be a heads up there. But as you mentioned, if you trade a player with the bye, then you're just moving that off. I personally would move Chase Brown, yes, depending on what works out. Because reality is you probably didn't draft Chase Brown much, and you've been sitting on Nico for a month and a half. Some other players potentially with Nico Collins, some bigger names, some real hot names that have cooled off. I would get rid of them if you can, possibly if you're trying to acquire J.K. Dobbins, Tony Pollard, my sweetness Bucky Irving, Drake London, George Pickens, Terry McLaurin. Those are a couple guys. I mean, even maybe Tyreek Hill. So those are guys I might be moving to acquire.
I think Nico's on a different level personally.
I do too.
I think what I'm trying to say is but true. He got hurt. He came his first game back. I think the other thing is you're banking on, by the way, if the owner who has Nico, because Nico got hurt and was out for a while, he might be right now heading into week 12, 5-6, and might be trying to get into the playoffs, and you can be like, hey, I'll give you some depth to fill in your wide receiver. Like we just talked about before with Jacoby Myers, right? To drop from maybe a London to Myers, but picking up an asset like a Jalen Warren type or something who might have a strong second half. The same could be flipped where like, hey, listen, if you're 5-6, you've been holding Nico and you're not in it and you're the 1 seed right now. Nico is someone you want. You could offer them a good deal. Like you could offer them guys that are solid players. Like you could offer them, listen, do we even dare say you could offer him Puka Nacua and a player like maybe like a Jalen Warren type who had a strong game this week? Would that get it done?
You wouldn't need to do both. I don't think you need to do both. I mean, Puka, if Puka's healthy, like Puka and Nico are on a similar tier, in my opinion, depending on the matchup and everything else. I don't think you need to do both.
But you're going to make that deal, though? Like, I don't think I'm going to do Puka for Nico swap. I'm just going to keep Nico. Like, if you offered me Puka, I'd be like, I'm good. I'm going to keep Nico. You would have to give me a little extra. And by the way, listen, Puka is awesome. Not saying Puka's not, but it just hasn't been there for him all year because of the injuries. So if you can kind of live with the name a little bit and favor the matchups with Nico,
I don't know, man. I'm going to push back. This will be fun. I'm going to push back on this specifically. We're getting off the radar a little bit. A couple things here. Thinking outside the box. Nico, we're just thinking Nico and Puka. I think that's a great high-level trade 1-for-1, okay? So Nico for Puka. Both of them have been injured this season, and both of them are coming back. Puka's been back for 4 games. Nico's been back for 1, and we'll see what happens, okay? So Puka's more like, unless he gets re-injured, he's ready to go. Nico, we'll see what happens when they ramp him up. They're similar quality when they're both high level, right? Puka does not have the worst schedule. We're not talking about him today, but Buffalo, San Francisco, the Jets, and Arizona, a couple of those at home. Don't hate those necessarily down the stretch. It's lower level, but we'll see. Also, he's had 3 100-yard games since coming back, and the targets are just fine. 9, 4, 14, and 9, right? So I would argue that Puka's been much better than Nico Collins. Obviously, he's been gone, and last week, alone, he's been a top 10 wide receiver the last couple of weeks. So I personally might go Puka. And you had talked earlier about the frustration with Stroud. I'm not saying Matt Stafford is a great fantasy quarterback per se, but I might trust that offense more because your darling Kyron Williams has finally come down to earth after the first 2 months, and Joe Mixon is the best running back in fantasy football right now. So again, just kind of on philosophy, like I start stacking that kind of stuff. I'm dodging a bye week. I have a great offense still. I don't mind the matchups. I don't know, man. I might go Puka over Nico personally.
Puka on the road against San Francisco.
Yeah, but okay, look, man, I'm a Niner fan. We're not the Niners right now.
Okay.
We're not.
Yeah, that's fine.
And we beat the Rams because McVay learned under Shanahan, right? So we beat the Rams usually, but they play us the best of anybody in the league every single time. And that's a dogfight game. It's usually, back and forth. So I don't know. I'm not as scared about that. And the Jets is going to be cold for that team, but I'm not really worried about that.
There's nuance to the discussion. He struggled 2 games last year against Arizona. Both games weren't great. San Francisco, I feel like on the road in San Francisco, you're not going to get the upside that you would get at home. And then the Jets is another game where I don't know what the hell's going on with the Jets. To be honest with you, they have these.
It could be snowing too.
When I'm looking at the schedule, and maybe you're right. Maybe this is a good example of you don't need to give up more. There's a Puka person out there that you could get Nico for straight up. Great, I'm doing that all day, and you don't even have to add anything in. I love every second of that. So that's good nuance. But I'm personally thinking in my mind Nico over Puka. But Puka, I guess, is not a sell. I mean, you're right. 3 of the last 4 games he's been back. He's been awesome. So I stand corrected in the sense of you need to add too much more. But to be honest with you, I'm still going to take Nico over Puka. All right, let's jump down to the next one. The Titans, by the way. And I think, and we can kind of maybe lump the last 2 together because these guys, ironically, were our teammates at one point. You got Calvin Ridley, who, by the way, I got to admit, even with Will Levis, looks awesome. Bengals, his playoff schedule, he's got 2 top 5 out wide matchups, and sandwiched in between, he has a game against the Colts, which I believe is in Indy in a dome. So You got to love this schedule for Calvin Ridley, who's really, really kind of emerged over the last few weeks. I guess this is another one where, obviously guys like, Drake London, DK Metcalf we've picked on today who have tougher schedules. Are you willing to trade those kind of receivers to get Calvin Ridley? But I also feel like this is another one of those scenarios where you can maybe downgrade to Ridley and get extra assets. What's your thoughts here?
Yeah, I've been a Ridley homer for a while. I was preseason. I was last year too, and he didn't pan out because he had a bunch of touchdowns, not touchdowns, and this year's been hit or miss. But the targets are there, right? And again, it's just something that I really value. 8, 9, 15, 8, 9, 6 targets since the bye week. So he's going to get the opportunity. I'm not worried about Jacksonville, not really worried about Cincinnati, not worried about Indianapolis, and then the championship again at Jacksonville. Couple divisional games, 3 divisional games in 4 weeks there down the stretch. Those are, not playoff games for any of those teams, but they're going to be higher level pride games at the end of the season for those lower seeds. So I like Calvin Ridley a lot, man. I think I would pay up more than other people would. Jalen Waddle, Quentin Johnston, Roma Dunze, just a couple other players in that general realm for me. Demario Douglas, Keenan Allen, Rashad Bateman. You'd have to pair up like 2 of those guys maybe for Calvin Ridley. But again, if you're a higher level team, you have, let's say, less than 3 losses, and you are looking to acquire just some depth, a high level wide receiver 2 potentially, but he's your wide receiver 4 or 5 flex to cover buys. I think you can give multiple pieces, a handcuff and one of those wide receivers I just mentioned for Calvin Ridley. I would absolutely do that.
Let me ask you this. If you have Puka Nacua, I offered you Calvin Ridley and Bucky Irving. You taking that deal?
Boy, I love all 3 players so much. That's a really good one. Give me 1 second. For me, it's at this point of the season, it's strictly on bye weeks. I know Puka doesn't have one. I know Calvin Ridley doesn't have one. And let me check Bucky Irving just 1 second. They just had theirs, I believe. Theirs. Yeah, they did. Yeah. So it's even keel. I don't love the schedule for Bucky Irving, but I love the opportunity. Look, I'm getting a running back 2, wide receiver 2 for Puka Nacua, who I absolutely love, but could have injury hustle. Honestly, man, I probably would do that deal. I think I'd want Calvin Ridley and Bucky Irving for Puka Nacua.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, the Bucky Irving schedule I think is outstanding. Giants, Carolina twice, Raiders, Chargers, Dallas. Dallas, we'll see. You can run on Dallas. I feel like I might be in the minority, but like Bucky Irving, earlier this week, 2 things that really stood out. One was before the bye, they gave Sean Tucker 0 touches, and they took him out of the game. And so they focused strictly on Irving and White. And the second thing was they also said in the beginning of this week, we need to get Bucky Irving more work. And that's coming from Todd Bowles. And then the other thing that I factored in here, and I really believe is going to change the dynamic is Mike Evans being back, because with Rachaad White was the preferred passing game back. So they had him on the field a bunch in the passing game role. But if you have your stud receiver back, you can get back to more of a traditional run game, focusing more on Irving. I'm in. I'm all in on Irving. I think he's someone that I would really like on my teams if I can get him. But I like to talk through this because there's scenarios where you can get, like we just talked about, you could just trade Puka Nacua, and that's not even a bad trade on either side. So if you get Calvin Ridley and Bucky Irving for Puka Nacua, who might have a little bit of his ceiling, by the way, he's still going to be good, but I just don't believe he's going to have wide receiver top 5 to 10 upside in the matchups he's had where he has to play those games. So
yeah, I mean, you don't have to talk about Bucky Irving to me, bro. First of all, I'm a Duck, so I'm biased no matter what. It just so happens that Bucky, Bo Nix, and Justin Herbert are all elite right now. They're all crushing, so I feel pretty good about that. So I'm a homer, but I think like rightfully so. Bucky Irving, like deeper stats are super fun for nerds like us. 53 qualifying running backs. He ranks 7th in explosive run rate. That's an incredible stat for a running back, and he's a rookie, by the way, folks. 3rd in missed tackles forced. Love that as well. We were talking about that with David Montgomery on the Bears. We're like, he just needs a better offense. Goes to the Lions. The dude's obviously exploded. I love that. 13th in yards after contact as well. And again, he's on par, in my opinion, with Rachaad White. They're 1 and 2. Bucky runs more. Rachaad White receives more, whatever. But Bucky is just a better, I think, running back with the ball in his hands and opportunity. And again, when Mike Evans does come back, they're going to be chucking it downfield more. I think that's going to lead to more opportunities for Bucky Irving, not so much for Rachaad White, because they just don't need him as much in the passing game. So we're off the wide receiver train. But yes, in that particular instance, I love me some Puka Nacua, obviously. I would go Calvin Ridley and Bucky Irving for the depth if I need it and move a horse like Puka Nacua.
Yeah, and let's go to the last one. It is the Kansas City Chiefs, and we're going to talk about DeAndre Hopkins here. And like, I honestly, when you're looking at the numbers, after the Tampa Bay game, you got super excited. And then the last two haven't really been that good. I mean, Denver 4 for 56, Buffalo 3 for 29. But those are two of the Broncos are an interesting loophole because they have a really good elite number one corner, but they still allow fantasy points out wide still. So I don't know how that, that's a very unique situation where they could shut down number ones with Patrick Surtain, but still allow a lot of fantasy, like an average amount of fantasy points out wide. So that's just, that's the only caveat. But if you flip over to their rest of season schedule, their playoff schedule, they have the Browns, who have allowed the 6th most fantasy points out wide, the Texans, and then the Chiefs. The Steelers, my apologies. And the Steelers, we just kind of saw all those matchups are right around league average or at least in the top 10. And I guess my thought process here, if you're looking at Kansas City and you're looking at their schedule, being on the road in Cleveland could be problematic. We don't know what the weather is going to be in Cleveland. Then they're at home against Houston. They always play well at home, but they're on the road again at Pittsburgh. So
in your championship, dude, no chance.
This is where the schedule meets potential downfall of December weather. And so is Hopkins even on your radar at the right price, knowing this schedule?
First of all, the dude's a fantasy football Hall of Famer and might be an NFL Hall of Famer at the end. Love the player. Love the team. Love Mahomes. I love his debut. Everything else, super red flags. No, thank you. He has, since that debut in Kansas City a couple weeks ago, and he was wide receiver 6 in PPR. He has 11. Let's see. Okay, first read share, right? So that's a nerd term for basically like when Mahomes drops back, who's he looking to first? Who's his first read, right? It was 62% in his debut. They obviously were like, get DeAndre Hopkins the ball. We want to make sure this trade made sense. Then it went to 11% because Travis Kelce, and then they have Worthy, and they got these other options. So I don't love that. And then he's got a 12% target share now last week. So on basic trends, I don't like that at all. Heading to the playoffs, Bob, you just mentioned it. Like, yes, there are some fruitful opportunities there, but we don't expect the snow like we had in Cleveland last night. But Pittsburgh is also outdoors. It could absolutely snow. It could be cold. And yes, the Chiefs are generally used to that in general. But I don't want to face the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are in the top seeds of the AFC right now with Mike Tomlin going up against that game, and have a very aging quickly DeAndre Hopkins going into my fantasy playoffs. I mean, I would rather take the upside on maybe a Jalen Waddle or having these guys we talked about who have been down a little bit, but maybe you can get them. Drake London, I'd rather take a chance on him. Potentially George Pickens, who's kind of come down to earth after the last couple of weeks. Terry McLaurin as well. Jamison Williams. Like, I'd rather have those kind of guys. If I'm looking for upside and like, I hope this works out, I'd rather have those kind of guys than DeAndre Hopkins, who I don't trust, A, for floor, and B, I'm not going to hope that he catches 2 of those touchdowns with, again, Isaiah Pacheco coming back too. So how does that change the offense in Kansas City overall?
I think this is one of those where, like, if it's at the right price, I'll take it. I'd rather have him than Darnell Mooney. Like, if I'm willing to get,
I disagree.
And like, I'd rather have that. I agree to disagree with you, because here's the other thing with the situation. If you look back at Mahomes, I just was curious. He completely lit up the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Sure.
So in the past, when he faced him last time, he went for 404 yards and 5 touchdown passes.
That's pretty good.
That's not too bad. The other one time before that, 258 and 3. Cleveland Browns, he played them, but this is a bad example because it was week 1, but he went 337 and 3. So like, but you're right. The matchups could be meh because of the weather, but the matchups themselves, like we just saw Jerry Jeudy play very well against Pittsburgh in the snow, by the way. So clearly there's something there. I know George Pickens didn't do great, but I mean, God, freaking everybody else for the Pittsburgh Steelers did good last night. And then the Texans game, I believe, as long as Nico is healthy, that the Texans offense will be good enough. I just think that at the right price, but actually the irony is going into this, I was about to say like, I'm super excited for Hopkins. And then you read into like where they're playing. You're like, you know what? It's gotta be like the right price for me now. I got to admit, I'm going to back off Hopkins a little bit. Not as excited as I was, but that's why we kind of look into this stuff and dive into the actual places where they're playing, because honestly, weather is going to freaking matter. I know no one gives a shit. We do this every year. Weather is going to matter. It is going to factor into your playoff games in December. So honestly, getting ahead of it a little bit, not too much, because obviously, we're not weather people. We can't predict the weather 6 weeks in advance, but this is just another reason like, hey, I'm glad we looked into it, because I do think we could back off a little bit about Hopkins. But before we close out the show, Sky, any other final thoughts before we move on to the next episode, which is going to be Sunday Live?
Yeah, just one other player in that mix that isn't very fantasy relevant himself, nor is the team, but I wanted to just mention him because he's on our grid. Once you go to football.razzball.com and check out our slot versus wide analysis for free, which you should all do right now. And Jose, we will get to your question here in just 1 second before we tune off. Xavier Leggett. I don't trust the Panthers at all, but he's the one out wide. Again, maybe just some handcuffs or something if you need to buy depth. I do like this kid a lot in Dynasty. You and I don't talk a lot about Dynasty right now this time of year. We're in redraft season, but I really, really believe in this kid moving forward once they solidify quarterback at some point. But he's just another guy in that mix. And then, again, just some of those deeper dives. I mean, like, again, Chris Olave, right? Like, you might be able to get him on the cheap because he hasn't played for a couple weeks, but be careful. They have the worst schedule, the Saints do, down the stretch. The Falcons, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, and then Brian Thomas Jr., we mentioned with the Jaguars. All the Seattle receivers, they have the fourth worst out wide schedule. So DK, Tyler Lockett, and JSN a little bit, but he's more in the slot. Then you have the Rams, who I think they're matchup proof. And then Dallas with CeeDee Lamb. So just be a little bit careful there. This is a great tool. We update it every single week. Ben Wasley drops a great article for us. It's live right now on the website that breaks down his starts and sits weekly based on the slot versus wide tool. So Bob and I are talking a few weeks in advance for the playoffs for you to get advanced in trade talks. But Ben breaks it down every single week for the starts and sits. It's a great tool to use yourself and great analysis from Ben on the website. So go check that out.
Yeah, let's get to some of these questions. And by the way, Jose, I thank you for being on the show. Thanks for waiting. I will say this. We already created a rest of season strength of schedule tool on Razzball using the slot versus wide data. And honestly, like, these are really good tools to use if you're trying to figure out, do I trade Lamb for Adams? And so here's my first thought. I think Lamb has now become a little more matchup dependent. I think he also becomes more home road split dependent. I think you're going to be looking at this week's game against the Commanders. I am not overly excited for Lamb. However, there's another downside to this. If they lose 2 straight, there could be a scenario where Trey Lance becomes the starter, and we don't have a clue what that's going to look like. Oof, like Cooper Rush. Listen, Cooper Rush, I could tell you. Oh, that's true. You do know. But listen, we know what Cooper Rush is. He knows where CeeDee Lamb is. He's going to throw 10 to 12 targets to CeeDee Lamb. Maybe they're 5 yards after depth of target, but God damn it, he's going to get PPR points.
Yep.
Adams on the other side of this whole situation is like, hasn't really clicked just yet, and I couldn't explain why. You would think Aaron Rodgers and him would be hit the ground running. But last week, I think, was the one week where against Indianapolis, you're like kind of confused. Like, what was Adams' final line against the
I'm in
He's 6 for
CD
7.
world. There you go.
6 for 72 is not too bad. I'm going to actually say yes. I'm going to take Davante Adams over Lamb. What's your thoughts here, Scott?
I have been telling personal friends who text me, whatever, people that, like, I don't have CeeDee Lamb anywhere because I wasn't willing to pay up for him in draft season. I just knew he wasn't going to be what he was last year as the number one guy. It just doesn't happen like that in fantasy. So I faded him a little bit. Now without Dak and everything else, I just hate it. Also, dude, I'm a vibes guy, Bob. You know this. The vibes in Dallas with Dak being out, them being horrendous, like just a bad team. Micah Parsons missed a bunch of time. CD's unhappy. The running game doesn't work out. Jerry's getting like all sorts of shit with his curtains in his stadium. Like, they're a nightmare in Dallas. CeeDee Lamb will get PPR, as you mentioned, but Davante and Rodgers are at least going to go out on top. I think the best that they can be with the Jets. Also, talking about schedules, the Dallas Cowboys and CeeDee Lamb specifically at Carolina doesn't sound scary, But in the last 4 weeks, Carolina has only given up the 14th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So they are getting better. And in that part of the season, we'll see what happens. So at Carolina in week 15, home against Tampa Bay, decent defense and top Bulls, and then championship weekend at Philadelphia. Now, CeeDee Lamb just had 21 yards against Philadelphia on 6 catches, by far his worst game of the season. He was 40th in PPR that week. Obviously, Cooper Rush first game there, but they're on the road versus Philly. We know Philly's going to be playing for something. Dallas is not going to be. So I'm really worried about his schedule, the vibes overall. So I'd rather have Adams as well.
Yeah. And by the way, Sky, I gotta reprimand you for a minute. Jesus Christmas, dude. We have a slot first wide tool on Razzball.com that tells you how many fantasy points the defense has allowed over the last 6 weeks, and you use another site. Honestly, at this point, you're fired. You're fired on the show. It's over. The Carolina Panthers have allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points out overall over the last 6 weeks. So there you go. That you can find on
I was doing 4
Razzball.com.
weeks, but either way.
That's okay. All right. That's all right. I still love you. Anyway, Jose, I need 2 wide receiver, 1 flex. He has Lamb, Brown, Evans,
Nice.
Puka. I think this is an easy just see you later, Lamb, goodbye. It's Brown, Evans, and Puka, correct?
Yeah, man. This is first of all, killer slot of wide receivers. I don't know how the hell you did that. But Evans coming back. I read a report today. Todd Bowles is basically, if he's healthy and he's out there, he's healthy and he's out there. Baker's going to pepper him. We just talked about Puka. I want him. And it's really hard to get off of AJ Brown when he's healthy. So I agree. Bench Lamb.
Yeah, I would say, and listen, I'm a Lamb owner too, and I can tell you from the heart, like I am trying to figure out ways to trade him. It's kind of tough right now. Obviously I talked in the group chat, guys I was considering are like Bucky Irving and Tyrone Tracy. So I'm hoping to get off Lamb if I can, because I am a little concerned, but I do think he's going to be good at home. So I think against the Giants next week, he'll be okay for fantasy football. So don't just sell him for just to sell him. All right. That's all we got today, folks. Once again, this is the top playoff schedule slot versus wide analysis. We want to thank you for joining us once again. Make sure you jump over to Razzball.com and check out all the content we got over there. Great writers, great stuff going on over there. And make sure you join us every Sunday live for 2 hours before kickoff. We break down all your start-sit questions. We also do a analysis, by the way, for injuries and weather updates, everything you need to know up until kickoff. We also wanted to say hi to Jamie. Jamie, thanks for jumping on. Always appreciate you being on, man. But once again, this is I want to think about Coach Sky Gawasco, by the way. This has been fun. Little throwback. Feels like it's 2021 or something all over again.
Good old days, man.
Good old days when we used to do this all the time. But it's been good, man. And we will be back on Sunday. So me and Sky have been on for like 8 hours this week. It's been super fun. So enjoy us once again, folks. Thank you, Sky, for joining. We are out of here.